It was a quiet Sunday morning in the small town of Springwood, Texas. The sun had barely risen above the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the sleepy streets. The town was known for its close-knit community, its charming homes, and the large stone church that stood in the center of Main Street. It was here, inside the church, where Reverend John Daniels had spent most of his life serving as the town's spiritual guide. His deep voice and soothing presence had earned him the respect of his congregation, and many considered him to be a man of great faith. But on this particular Sunday, something was different. Reverend Daniels had been living a lie for the past few years, one that was beginning to unravel. His wife Rachel, a popular social media influencer with a massive following, had been hiding a secret from him, a secret that would soon destroy everything they had built together. Rachel had been everything John had ever dreamed of. Beautiful, confident, and ambitious, she had captured his heart the moment they met. They had an open marriage, something that John had always been uncomfortable with, but he had agreed to it because he loved her. Rachel was young and vibrant, and she had a life of her own that included traveling the world, making money from sponsored posts, and living a life of luxury. John, on the other hand, had devoted his life to his congregation and had little time for anything beyond his duties as a preacher. Their arrangement had worked, at least for a while, but John had always been suspicious of the people Rachel surrounded herself with, the influencers, the models, the businessmen. There had been rumors of her having affairs, though she had always denied them. And now, there was something else troubling John. Something he could not ignore any longer. He had discovered that Rachel had been hiding something from him. She had gone to great lengths to conceal it. But John's curiosity had gotten the best of him. He had found a letter hidden in Rachel's drawer, addressed to a private clinic in Dallas. The letter revealed that Rachel had undergone a secret abortion, something that John had never known about. But it wasn't just any abortion. The letter stated that the procedure had been necessary because Rachel had a medical condition that left her unable to have children. It was the one thing John had always wanted, a family. The discovery shattered John. He had been so caught up in his own guilt about their open marriage that he had never questioned Rachel's loyalty. But now he felt betrayed in the worst way. He had devoted his life to her, believed in their love, and yet she had kept this from him. John's heart ached with a mixture of anger and confusion. He was furious at Rachel for not telling him the truth, for not trusting him enough to share this with him. But he also felt a deep sense of shame, as if he had failed as a husband and a man of God. He couldn't understand why Rachel had kept this secret from him and why she had chosen to terminate the pregnancy without telling him. It was a betrayal he could not forgive. As the hours passed, John's mind raced. He paced back and forth in their small living room, his thoughts consumed by the pain of the discovery. He needed answers. He needed to confront Rachel, but he knew that he had to be careful. He had always prided himself on being a patient and understanding man. But this was different. He couldn't let it go. Later that afternoon, Rachel came home, her face lighting up when she saw him sitting in the living room. She had no idea what he had discovered, and she greeted him with her usual warmth and affection. But John wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. He stood up abruptly, his eyes cold and distant. "Rachel," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "we need to talk." Rachel's smile faltered. She could tell something was wrong. "What's going on, John? You look different." John's hands shook as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter. "What's this? Why didn't you tell me?" Rachel's face went pale as she saw the letter in his hand. She took a step back, her mouth opening in shock. "John, I didn't mean for you to find out. Please, let me explain." John's heart pounded in his chest. "Explain? How could you keep something like this from me? How could you do this behind my back?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she tried to reach out to him. "John, I was trying to protect you. I didn't want to hurt you, but it was too late. The damage had been done." John's world was collapsing around him, and he could feel the walls closing in. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and confusion. How could he trust her again? How could he ever forgive her? He didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain. He couldn't live with this lie. Not anymore. As the night fell over Springwood, Reverend John Daniels made a decision that would change everything. He had vowed to protect his family, to lead them with faith and love, but now he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The preacher who had once stood at the pulpit, preaching about forgiveness, had now found himself consumed by something darker, a need for revenge. Rachel, unaware of the storm brewing within her husband, lay in bed that night, her phone buzzing with notifications from her followers. She was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. In the shadows of their home, John's mind raced. What was he going to do? And how far was he willing to go to make Rachel pay for the betrayal she had caused? The night passed in eerie silence. The tension in the house was palpable. Reverend John Daniels lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through thoughts of betrayal and heartbreak. His wife, Rachel, lay beside him, oblivious to the storm that was brewing in his mind. She slept soundly, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. John's mind couldn't rest. He kept replaying the conversation they had had earlier, the shock of discovering the letter, Rachel's tear-streaked face, her desperate attempts to explain. But nothing she said made sense. It felt like a flimsy excuse for the truth she had been hiding from him for years. A truth so painful, so deep, that it threatened to destroy everything they had built together. He kept thinking about the abortion, the one Rachel had kept secret. The letter from the clinic in Dallas had made it clear. She had undergone the procedure because she had no womb. It wasn't just a matter of her choosing not to have children. She physically could not. The one thing John had always dreamed of, starting a family with Rachel, had been nothing more than a lie. His hands clenched into fists as the anger rose within him. He had always trusted Rachel, believed in her, loved her. But now all he felt was betrayal. How could she do this to him? Why hadn't she told him the truth? The open marriage they had agreed upon had always been a delicate balance. John had accepted it, begrudgingly at first because he thought it was what Rachel needed. She was young, vibrant, and full of life. She had ambitions beyond the confines of their small town, ambitions that involved fame and success. He had accepted her choices, convinced himself that their bond was strong enough to withstand it. But now it seemed like the bond had been nothing more than an illusion. The more he thought about it, the more John felt a deep, gnawing emptiness inside. How could he ever trust her again? How could he look at her the same way? He had devoted his life to serving God, to being a man of integrity and righteousness. But now he felt like a fool. His whole life had been built on a foundation of lies, and Rachel's secret had exposed the cracks in everything he had known. He stood up from the bed, his heart racing. His breathing was shallow, his mind clouded with confusion. He needed answers. He needed to know why she had kept this from him for so long. He needed to confront her again, to make her understand the depth of the betrayal he was feeling. But deep down, John knew that it wasn't just about understanding. He wasn't sure if he could forgive her. The clock on the nightstand read 2:15 a.m. John walked out of the bedroom quietly, careful not to wake Rachel. He made his way to the living room where he sat in silence, staring at the walls. He didn't know what to do anymore. He had always been a man of faith, a man who preached love, forgiveness, and understanding. But what if those ideals didn't apply here? What if the only thing that mattered now was the pain inside him, the deep sense of being wronged by the one person he had trusted more than anyone else? In the dim light of the living room, John's thoughts grew darker. He didn't want to feel this way. He didn't want to be consumed by anger. But he was. It was like a fire had been lit inside him, one that couldn't be extinguished. He felt betrayed, broken, and helpless. And the more he thought about it, the more the idea of revenge began to creep into his mind. The next morning when Rachel woke up, she noticed something was off. John was already up and had left the house. This wasn't unusual. He often went to the church early to prepare for his sermons. But something about the way he had acted the night before left her uneasy. The silence between them had been heavier than it had ever been, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to push the thought aside as she went about her morning routine. Her followers on social media were waiting for her next post, and she had a sponsored campaign to prepare. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on her work, she couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with John. The look in his eyes when he confronted her with the letter, it was like he was seeing her for the first time, but with a new kind of suspicion. She had always been able to read him, to understand his moods, but now he seemed distant, cold. Rachel tried to call him a few times, but he didn't answer. She sent him a text asking if he was okay, but still no reply. It wasn't like John to ignore her. He was always there when she needed him, especially after difficult conversations. But now he was avoiding her. As the day wore on, Rachel's unease grew. She couldn't focus on anything. The nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach refused to go away. She decided to drive to the church to find him, hoping to talk things through, to explain herself. But when she arrived at the church, John was nowhere to be found. Confused and worried, Rachel returned home. It was then that she noticed something strange. The door to their bedroom was slightly ajar, and when she pushed it open, she found John sitting on the bed, staring at the floor. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his hands trembled. "John?" Rachel called softly, stepping into the room. "What's going on? Why are you avoiding me?" John didn't answer at first. He just sat there lost in thought. Then finally he looked up at her, his gaze piercing. "Do you think I'm a fool, Rachel?" His voice was low, trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. Rachel's heart sank. "John, please, let me explain." "Explain?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "Explain why you lied to me? Why you kept this secret from me for so long?" Rachel took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. She had never seen John like this before. His anger was unlike anything she had ever experienced. "John, please. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could protect you from the truth. I didn't want you to look at me differently." "But you've already done that, Rachel," John whispered, his voice breaking. "You've already destroyed everything we had." Rachel stood frozen in place, the weight of his words crashing down on her. She knew that things had changed, but she hadn't expected this. This fury in John's eyes, the deep sense of betrayal that hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. And in that moment, Rachel realized something she had been trying to ignore. Things were never going to be the same again. The tension in the room was suffocating. Rachel stood there, frozen in disbelief as her husband John seethed in anger before her. The pain in his eyes was palpable, the weight of his hurt almost unbearable. She could feel the love between them fraying, unraveling, bit by bit, and she didn't know how to fix it. No matter how many times she tried to explain herself, the damage had already been done. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. John stood up abruptly, his body stiff with fury. His eyes were wide, filled with an intensity that Rachel had never seen before. The calm, collected preacher she had known all these years had been replaced by a man who was consumed by grief and betrayal. His voice trembled as he spoke, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down her spine. "You've ruined us, Rachel," John said through clenched teeth. "You've ruined everything we built. I believed in you. I believed in us." Rachel felt her heart shatter as she watched him, helpless. She had always known that John was a man of integrity, of faith, but she had never realized how deeply he trusted her. How could she have been so blind? Why hadn't she been honest with him from the beginning? She had been trying to protect him, trying to shield him from the truth, but all she had done was destroy him in the process. "I didn't mean to hurt you, John," Rachel said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought if I kept it a secret, it wouldn't change anything. But now I see I was wrong." John shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Wrong? Rachel, you didn't just keep a secret. You lied to me. You took away the one thing I wanted most. Family. You knew I wanted children, and you kept that from me. You knew I couldn't give you what you wanted, and yet you didn't tell me. You kept me in the dark, thinking I was some fool." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She had done enough crying, enough pleading. She could see the anger in John's eyes, the disbelief, and the hurt. It was too late for apologies, too late for explanations. She had broken something too fragile, too precious, and now she couldn't undo it. I thought you could forgive me, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I thought, I thought we could move past it. I thought we had something strong enough to withstand this. John's eyes darkened as he took a step closer to her, his anger simmering just below the surface. Move past it? How can I move past this, Rachel? How can I forgive you for something like this? This isn't just about having children. It's about trust. It's about you betraying me in the worst way possible. You've taken away my faith in you, in us. The words stung like a slap, and Rachel could feel herself crumbling under the weight of them. She had never imagined that things would get this far. She had never imagined that John would look at her like this, with so much hatred and bitterness in his eyes. I never meant to hurt you, Rachel repeated, but her voice lacked conviction now. She knew that nothing she said could take away the pain John felt. She had crossed a line, and no amount of apologizing would fix what had been broken. John turned away, walking toward the window, his back to her. You've hurt me more than you'll ever understand, he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I knew you. I thought you were the woman I married. But now, I don't even know who you are anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel felt the emptiness of it, the finality in John's words. She had lost him, she realized. He was no longer the man who had stood by her side, the man who had supported her dreams. He was a stranger now, someone she had betrayed, someone she had pushed away. I'm sorry, Rachel said, the words barely escaping her lips. I'm so sorry. But John didn't respond. He didn't turn to look at her. He stood there staring out the window, lost in his thoughts, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. Rachel's heart ached, but she knew that there was nothing more to be said. The damage was done, and there was no way to undo it. The love they had once shared was gone, replaced by a deep, painful divide that seemed insurmountable. As she stood there, watching John's silhouette against the window, she realized the truth. Their marriage was over. Later that afternoon, after hours of silence between them, Rachel left the house. She couldn't stay there any longer. She needed space, time to process everything that had happened. She needed to clear her mind, to try to make sense of it all. She went to a nearby cafe, sitting by the window with a coffee in front of her, staring out at the busy street. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but there was one thing she couldn't escape, the feeling that something was wrong. John had been acting different since the night before, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. He was angry, yes, but there was something more to it, something darker. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her assistant, asking if she was ready for a live stream she had scheduled for later that evening. Rachel had forgotten about it. She had been so consumed with the fallout from her conversation with John that she had pushed everything else aside. But as she glanced down at her phone, she noticed something strange. A message from an unknown number. Rachel, we need to talk. I know what you did. Meet me at the church. It's time to make things right. Her heart skipped a beat. She felt a cold chill run down her spine as she stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. Who could it be? And what did they mean by make things right? Her instincts told her not to go. But there was a part of her, the part that had always tried to fix things, that urged her to meet this person. Maybe they had answers. Maybe they could explain what had really been going on with John. But deep down, Rachel knew that the answers she was looking for might be far darker than she was ready to face. Back at the house, John sat alone in the living room, his mind a storm of emotions. He had tried to pray, to find some peace, but he couldn't. His thoughts kept circling back to Rachel, to the betrayal that had shattered everything. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't forgive her. And as he sat there, an unsettling thought began to form in his mind. What if Rachel didn't just lie to him about the abortion? What if there was more to the story? What if she had been hiding something even darker than he had imagined? John's heart raced as the thought consumed him. Could it be true? Could Rachel have been involved in something that went beyond betrayal? The anger inside him flared once again, and the desire for revenge began to take root. He had always preached forgiveness, but now he wasn't sure he could forgive her, not after everything she had done. As the minutes ticked by, John felt a cold resolve settle over him. There was only one way to find the truth. Only one way to make sure that everything Rachel had done was exposed for what it really was. And as that thought lingered in his mind, a dark, dangerous plan began to take shape. Detective Elena Morris had seen many things in her time. A seasoned investigator with over 15 years in the force, she had dealt with some of the most complex cases, from brutal murders to elaborate financial scams. But something about the case of Rachel Daniels, the social media influencer, piqued her curiosity. It was different. It didn't feel like the typical domestic dispute gone wrong. There was an underlying sense of mystery, a feeling that something deeper was at play. The call had come in early that morning, just as Elena was sipping her coffee at her desk. The sheriff's office had been alerted to a disturbing situation at the Daniels home. John Daniels, a local preacher, had been found in a state of distress after an apparent altercation with his wife. But Rachel Daniels, an up-and-coming influencer who had over 1 million followers on social media, was nowhere to be found. At first, Elena thought it was just another case of a domestic argument gone too far, but something about it didn't sit right. The sheriff had mentioned that John had been acting strangely, and there was no sign of Rachel anywhere in the house. He'd reported his wife missing and claimed he had no idea where she had gone. But Elena wasn't buying it. There were too many inconsistencies in his story. She arrived at the Daniels home an hour later, her mind already racing through potential scenarios. As she approached the house, she couldn't help but notice the unsettling silence that surrounded it. The manicured lawn, the freshly painted white fence, and the serene suburban neighborhood, it all felt too perfect, too staged. But beneath the facade, Elena sensed something darker. She was greeted by Officer Matthews, who briefed her on the situation. He had been the first to respond to the call, and his unease was palpable. "Detective, there's something strange about this one," Matthews said, his voice low. "John Daniels he's acting off. You need to talk to him. He won't tell us anything concrete, just says he doesn't know where Rachel is." Elena nodded. "I'll talk to him. Where is he now?" "He's inside, pacing around the living room. It's like he's lost his mind," Matthews replied. "All right," Elena said, stepping forward. "Let's get to it." Inside the house, John Daniels was sitting on the couch, his face pale and haggard. His normally neat appearance had been replaced with a disheveled look, his shirt untucked, his hair unkempt. When Elena entered the room, he didn't look up at first. His hands were shaking as he held a glass of water, but he didn't drink it. Instead, he stared at the floor, lost in thought. "Mr. Daniels," Elena said calmly, her voice even, yet commanding. "I'm Detective Morris. I'm here to help you. We just need to talk about what happened." John's eyes slowly lifted to meet hers, but there was no recognition in his gaze. He looked like a man who had been through hell, and Elena knew that his emotions were raw. But she also knew that as a seasoned investigator, the truth was often hidden beneath layers of confusion, denial, and fear. "I don't know where she is," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean for her to leave." Elena didn't buy it. "John, we need you to be honest with us. We know there was an argument last night. Can you tell me what happened?" John shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. He seemed hesitant, like he was trying to process what he had done, but Elena could see that he wasn't telling her everything. "I found out something that changed everything," he said, his voice cracking. "Rachel wasn't honest with me. She kept a secret, a big secret." Elena's instincts told her that this was where the story began. "What secret, John?" John's eyes darkened as he spoke. "I found a letter from a clinic in Dallas. Rachel had an abortion years ago. She has no womb. She couldn't have children. She lied to me all this time, told me she wanted a family, but she could never give me one." Elena felt a pang of sympathy for him, but she didn't let it show. She had learned long ago that emotions had no place in an investigation. What mattered now was the truth. "Did she tell you why she kept it a secret?" Elena asked, leaning forward slightly. John shook his head. "She said she was protecting me, that I wouldn't understand, that I'd leave her if I knew the truth. But how could she think I wouldn't have loved her anyway? I would have accepted her for who she was, but she lied to me. All these years. She betrayed me. Elena's mind raced as she listened to John's words. There was something more to this than a simple domestic argument. The secrecy, the lies. Something wasn't adding up. And then there was the fact that Rachel was missing. Had she fled, or had something more sinister happened? John, Elena said softly, her voice steady but sharp. Where is Rachel now? He looked at her, his eyes filled with fear. I don't know, he whispered. She was upset. She left, but I don't know where she went. She hasn't been back since last night. I don't even know if she's alive anymore. The mystery of Rachel's disappearance only deepened after John's confession. Elena knew that this was no ordinary missing person case. There were too many questions, too many inconsistencies, and John's emotional state seemed too erratic to be entirely genuine. Elena decided to focus on the next logical step, retracing Rachel's steps and looking into the events that led up to the argument. She requested that John provide any relevant information, such as Rachel's recent social media activity or any contacts she might have been in touch with before she disappeared. The fact that Rachel was a well-known influencer made her an even more intriguing subject in the case. Elena needed to know everything about her life, her relationships, and her online persona. As the investigation continued, Elena spoke with Rachel's close friends and colleagues, trying to piece together the timeline of events. They all spoke highly of Rachel, charismatic, driven, and seemingly happy with her life and marriage. But when Elena dug deeper, she uncovered subtle signs of tension, particularly in Rachel's recent posts. There were cryptic messages about feeling trapped and lost that seemed to hint at deeper emotional struggles. Had Rachel been hiding her true feelings all along? Or was she trying to send a message to someone? But it was the phone records that revealed the most unsettling information. Rachel had been in frequent contact with a man named Marcus, someone she had been secretly seeing behind John's back. It was unclear what their relationship was, but the frequency of their communication suggested something more than just a friendship. Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she connected the dots. John had discovered Rachel's secret about her inability to have children, and he was already emotional and volatile. Now it appeared that Rachel had been leading a double life, and perhaps she was planning to leave John for someone else. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the truth was still just out of reach. As Elena sat at her desk later that evening, reviewing the case file, a new thought struck her. What if Rachel hadn't left willingly? What if John's discovery had triggered something far darker? Could he have been involved in her disappearance? Or worse, had he been responsible for something more sinister? With a sense of urgency, Elena instructed Officer Matthews to increase the search efforts for Rachel. She also put out an APB for her car, hoping that any new leads would point them in the right direction. But time was running out. Every hour that passed without a trace of Rachel brought more questions and more fear that they might be too late. The following days felt like a slow unraveling, a descent into uncertainty. Detective Elena Morris had thrown herself into the investigation, following every lead, interviewing every person in Rachel's life who might have known something, anything, that could explain her disappearance. But no one seemed to know anything concrete. Friends and colleagues were still in shock, unable to believe that Rachel, the social media queen who had captivated millions, could have vanished so suddenly. Elena's mind kept returning to the same haunting question. Did John know more than he was letting on? Every piece of evidence pointed to a man who had been blindsided by betrayal, a man whose faith had been shattered by his wife's lies. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Her gut told her that John wasn't just an angry husband dealing with heartbreak. There was something darker lurking beneath the surface. The more Elena delved into the case, the more she realized how little she truly knew about John Daniels. Sure, he was a respected preacher in the community, a man whose sermons had touched many lives. But what lay beneath that calm, devout exterior? What was he hiding? It was a Thursday morning when Elena finally decided to confront John once again. He had been cooperative, perhaps too cooperative, at least on the surface. He had agreed to her request to search the house, to provide any evidence that could help locate Rachel. But Elena knew he was holding back. There was something in the way he spoke, the way his eyes darted nervously when certain topics were brought up. His behavior had all the hallmarks of someone trying to hide something. When Elena arrived at the Daniels house, she found John sitting in the same spot he had been in during their first meeting, as though time had stood still for him. He hadn't changed out of his wrinkled clothes, his hair still unkempt. His entire demeanor screamed of exhaustion and distress, but there was also an underlying tension in the air, like a pressure building up, waiting to burst. "Mr. Daniels," Elena said, her voice steady and professional, "I need you to tell me the truth. Where is your wife?" John's eyes flickered, but he remained silent. His fingers tightened around the glass in his hand, and Elena could see the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. He was breaking down, but Elena knew it was because he was trying to control the narrative. She could sense it. He was teetering on the edge. "I've told you everything I know," John replied, his voice shaky. "Rachel left. I don't know where she went." Elena stepped closer, her gaze fixed on him. "John, this isn't just about where she went. It's about what happened before she disappeared. It's about the secrets you've been keeping from me, from everyone." He flinched at her words, his face paling even further. Elena had struck a nerve. She took a step back, her mind racing. There was something about his reaction, something that didn't fit. "John, you're not being honest with me. You found out something about Rachel, didn't you? Something that made you lose control. And I need you to tell me what that was." John's breath hitched, his shoulders trembling. He couldn't look her in the eye anymore. Instead, he stared at the floor, his entire body rigid with the weight of his emotions. "I found out," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I found out she could never give me children. I thought we were going to start a family. I believed in her, Elena. I trusted her." Elena took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. She had heard the story already, but there was something different in the way John said it now. He wasn't just mourning the loss of his dreams. He was mourning the loss of something far more significant, his sense of control, of trust, of everything he had believed in. "But that's not the whole story, is it, John?" Elena pressed. "You're hiding something more, something you haven't told me." John's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained firm. "I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think she could be capable of something so cruel. But when I found the letter, the one from the clinic, I saw it all. Rachel had an abortion years ago, and then she kept it from me. She said she did it to protect me, but I don't believe her. I think she was trying to hide something from me, and I couldn't take it anymore." Elena felt the weight of John's words settle heavily in the room. He was unraveling, breaking down in front of her, and for a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. He was a man who had been shattered by the truth, who had been betrayed by the one person he thought he could trust. But Elena couldn't let that cloud her judgment. She had a job to do, and that job was to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "Did you hurt her, John?" Elena asked, her voice calm but firm. "Did you do something to her?" John's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. He shook his head frantically, his hands trembling. No, I would never hurt her. I loved her too much. I just wanted to understand why she lied to me. I wanted her to tell me the truth, but she wouldn't. And then she left. I don't know where she went. I don't know if she's even alive anymore." Elena studied John's face carefully. His eyes were filled with fear, but there was something about his expression that didn't sit right. He was hiding something he didn't want to admit, something that could change everything. "Where were you the night Rachel disappeared, John?" Elena asked, her tone cutting through the tension in the room. "I told you I was here," he replied, his voice rising in frustration. "I was waiting for her to come back. I didn't know what to do. I was lost." Elena could see the fear in his eyes, but it was tinged with something else, something darker. She needed to dig deeper. She needed to find out the truth. "John, I need you to think carefully," Elena said, her voice low and steady. "Did Rachel leave on her own, or did something happen to her? Did you have anything to do with it?" John recoiled at the question, his eyes widening in panic. "No, I didn't." But his words were cut short as Elena noticed a faint stain on his shirt, a dark, reddish-brown mark, barely noticeable unless you were looking closely. Elena's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? She moved closer, her gaze fixed on the stain. "John," she said quietly, "what's this?" John's face drained of color as he realized what she was pointing to. He stepped back, his hands raised defensively. "I didn't," he began, but his words faltered. Elena's mind was already racing. The stain, the nervousness in John's eyes. It wasn't just a random mark. Something had happened that night. Something he didn't want to admit. Something that had caused Rachel to disappear. Elena knew she was getting closer to the truth. Detective Elena Morris couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in her chest after her confrontation with John Daniels. The stain on his shirt was just the beginning. There was something far darker at play here, something that John had yet to fully reveal. But the fear in his eyes, combined with the undeniable mark of blood on his clothing, was enough to raise her suspicions even higher. Something terrible had happened in that house, and Rachel Daniels' disappearance was no accident. Elena knew she had to act fast. Every second counted now. She needed to gather more evidence, not just from John, but from every angle she could. Her mind raced with possibilities as she recalled the recent discoveries. The letter from the clinic, the secret abortion, the affair with Marcus, and John's emotional instability. It was becoming clear that there was more to Rachel's life and death than anyone could have guessed. John's reaction to the bloodstain had given Elena the confirmation she needed. The stain was not from an innocent accident or a trivial mistake. No, this was the kind of stain that told a far more sinister story. As soon as Elena left the Daniels home, she ordered Officer Matthews to collect samples from the shirt and any other clothing items John might have worn that night. Blood spatter could tell a different story, one that would either confirm or contradict John's claims of innocence. The forensic team was called in to conduct a thorough investigation of the house. Every inch of the home, every possible clue, would be examined with precision. Elena knew it would take time, but she couldn't afford to waste another moment. She needed to find Rachel before it was too late. There was no way she would let this case go cold, not when so much was at stake. As the forensic team began their work, Elena decided to focus on the other part of the puzzle, the mysterious man named Marcus. If Rachel had been having an affair, then Marcus might hold key information about her life and the events leading up to her disappearance. Elena instructed Matthews to track him down. It didn't take long for the detective to find Marcus. He was a freelance photographer, the kind who often worked with influencers like Rachel, capturing moments for their social media pages. When Elena met him in a local cafe, she could immediately sense the tension in the air. Marcus was nervous, more than he should have been. His face was familiar, the type of good-looking man who could easily charm his way into the hearts of many. But today his confidence was gone, replaced by an anxious demeanor. "Marcus," Elena said as she slid into the booth across from him, her voice calm but commanding. "I'm Detective Morris. I'm here to ask you about Rachel Daniels." His expression shifted slightly, the color draining from his face. "I don't know what you want from me," he stammered, looking away. "I don't know where she is. I haven't heard from her in days." "That's what we're trying to figure out," Elena replied, her tone steady. "But I have reason to believe you were very close to Rachel. Were you having an affair with her?" Marcus swallowed hard. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he fidgeted, his eyes darting around the cafe as if he were searching for a way out of the conversation. After a long pause, he finally nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, we were seeing each other, but I didn't know anything about what happened to her. She's been distant lately." Elena leaned in closer, her voice low but firm. "What do you mean by distant, Marcus? Was she afraid of something? Or someone?" Marcus hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. Rachel. Rachel wasn't herself recently. She seemed scared, like she was hiding something. She talked about leaving her husband, but I didn't know she was that serious. And then, all of a sudden, she cut me off. She stopped answering my calls, stopped replying to my messages. I thought it was over, but I never imagined something like this would happen. Elena's mind raced as Marcus spoke. There it was again, Rachel's fear, her sense of being trapped. And now it seemed, Marcus had been the one person she had turned to when she felt she couldn't talk to anyone else. "Did Rachel say anything about her marriage?" Elena asked. "Was there something specific that caused her to pull away from John?" Marcus looked down at his coffee, swirling it absent-mindedly as he processed the question. Rachel said that John had changed. She said he wasn't the man she married anymore, that he was getting more controlling, more obsessed with his image. She didn't feel like she could breathe in that marriage anymore. And then she told me something I couldn't believe. Elena leaned forward, her interest piqued. What did she tell you? Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. She said she couldn't have children, that she had been hiding it from John for years. She had an abortion a long time ago, and she never told him. She said he would leave her if he found out the truth. Elena felt her blood run cold. The puzzle pieces were fitting together, but not in the way she had hoped. Rachel's life had been built on lies. Lies that had shattered her marriage, lies that had led to her disappearance. And now those same lies were leading Elena closer to the truth of what had happened. Did Rachel ever talk about leaving him for good? Elena asked. Marcus hesitated. Yeah, she said she was thinking about it, but she didn't know how. She was scared of what John might do. I think she was afraid he would hurt her if he found out. Elena's heart raced. It wasn't just about Rachel's disappearance anymore. It was about something far more dangerous. A woman trapped in a marriage, afraid of the truth getting out, and a man unable to control his emotions, his world slowly falling apart as his faith and his family were ripped from him. Later that evening, Elena sat alone in her office, reviewing the evidence. The forensic reports had just come back. The blood on John's shirt wasn't just a stain, it was proof of a struggle. Rachel had fought back. There were traces of her blood found in multiple places inside the house. The crime scene was a mess, an angry confrontation that had spiraled out of control. And then there was the final piece of the puzzle, Rachel's phone. A call had been placed from her phone at 2:15 a.m., just hours after the argument. The number was unregistered, but after some digging, Elena discovered that it belonged to a local emergency services number. Someone had tried to reach out. Someone had been in distress, but it was too late. Elena leaned back in her chair, staring at the case file in front of her. She knew what she had to do. The truth was coming to light, slowly, painfully, but the darkness still loomed over it all. John Daniels was a man on the edge, a preacher who had lost his faith in the worst way possible. And if Elena was right, Rachel's death wasn't just an accident. It was the consequence of a man who couldn't handle the truth. Detective Elena Morris stood at the edge of the Daniels house, watching the lights flicker in the distance. It was nearing midnight, and the cold breeze swept through the street like a reminder of the silence that had consumed this neighborhood. The investigation had reached its peak. Every lead had pointed toward one person, and every piece of evidence was now stacked against him. John Daniels was not just a preacher anymore. He was a suspect, a man who had killed his wife in a fit of rage and jealousy. As Elena reviewed the case in her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something John had left out of his confession, something she hadn't yet uncovered. His words, his fear, his broken demeanor, it all fit the profile of a man on the edge. But Elena had learned long ago that people didn't just snap overnight. There was always a deeper story, a chain of events that led up to a violent act. The forensic team had confirmed that Rachel's blood was found throughout the house, but there was something even more chilling. Rachel's final moments were recorded on her phone. Just a few minutes before she died, she had made a call. Elena had listened to the audio, her heart pounding as she heard Rachel's voice, desperate and frantic. The call had been short, but it was clear. Rachel had been trying to escape. She had been in fear for her life. "John, please." Rachel's voice trembled through the phone. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was trying to protect us. But you need to understand. You need to." The phone had cut off abruptly, and there was nothing more. No answer, no sound of struggle, just the eerie silence that followed. Elena's mind raced. John had been the one to end that call, to silence Rachel's last plea for mercy. She knew it was time to confront him one final time. There would be no more room for lies, no more room for denial. The next morning, John Daniels was arrested at his church. It was early, the sun barely rising, as Elena and Officer Matthews led him out of the building in handcuffs. He was still in his Sunday best, his face pale and hollow. But even in the harsh light of day, There was a coldness to him, a man who had already made peace with what he had done. His hands trembled as he walked, but his steps were deliberate. John knew this moment was inevitable, and he had resigned himself to it. Elena had called him into the station for one last interview. She needed him to confess, to finally admit what he had done. She couldn't afford any more games. When they sat across from each other, John seemed almost peaceful. He looked like a man who had come to terms with his actions, a man who had been burdened by guilt for so long that he had simply accepted it. "John," Elena began, her voice calm, but cutting through the air like a knife. "You know why you're here. We have all the evidence we need. Rachel is dead, and you're the one who killed her." John's eyes remained fixed on the table in front of him. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He simply sat there waiting for Elena to speak. "I don't know why you did it, John. I don't understand how a man of faith could take the life of his own wife. But I'm sure you've had time to think about it. Time to think about how you ended up here." John finally looked up, meeting Elena's gaze for the first time since their earlier interviews. His face was hollow, his eyes distant, but there was something almost resigned in the way he spoke. "I didn't want to do it," John whispered. "I loved Rachel. I really did. But she lied to me. She lied to me about everything. She wasn't the woman I thought she was. She kept things from me, things I couldn't ignore." Elena's voice softened. "But why kill her, John? Why didn't you just leave? You could have walked away." John's lips trembled as he fought to hold back tears. He closed his eyes for a moment, collecting himself. "I didn't know what else to do. I found out about the abortion, about her not being able to have children. I couldn't bear it. I thought we could build a family. I thought we could be happy, but she kept hiding things from me. It was like she didn't trust me anymore. It broke me." "But that wasn't enough to kill her, John," Elena said gently. "That wasn't a reason to take her life." "I know," John replied, his voice breaking. "But when I found out she'd been seeing someone else, Marcus, I couldn't control myself. She had betrayed me. The woman I thought I knew. She wasn't real. I wanted her to admit it to me. I wanted her to confess, to explain herself, but she wouldn't. And when she tried to leave me, when she said she was going to walk away for good, I lost it." John's voice cracked as he spoke the next words, his guilt palpable in the silence that followed. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I just wanted her to stay. I begged her to come back, but she wouldn't listen. She tried to leave, and I pushed her. She hit her head, and then it all just spiraled out of control." Elena's heart tightened as she listened to John's confession. There it was. The truth had finally come out, but it was too late. Rachel was gone, and John had shattered everything in a moment of blind rage. "But you didn't stop there, did you, John?" Elena asked, her voice firm. "You silenced her when she tried to reach out. You ended that call." John's face contorted with pain as he remembered the final moments of his wife's life. "I didn't know what I was doing. I just wanted it all to end. I thought if I could stop her from leaving, stop her from going to Marcus, maybe she would stay. But she never did. She was gone. How did you think this would end, John?" Elena's words were soft, but they cut deep. "How did you think you could escape the consequences?" John didn't respond. He just sat there, tears streaming down his face, his hands trembling in his lap. As the days passed and the investigation reached its conclusion, the community was left to process the shocking truth. The preacher, the man who had once been a symbol of faith and morality, had taken the life of the woman he claimed to love. His guilt, his betrayal, his inability to cope with the cracks in his marriage had all led to a devastating, irreversible act of violence. Rachel's death had sparked a wave of grief, anger, and disbelief in the community. The woman they had all admired, beautiful, strong, independent, was gone. And all that remained was the story of a love that had turned toxic, a life that had been stolen in a moment of fury and heartbreak. As for John Daniels, the preacher who had once preached about redemption, forgiveness, and grace, he was now facing the consequences of his actions. His life was ruined, and there would be no coming back from what he had done. Detective Elena Morris closed the case file with a heavy heart. The truth had been uncovered and justice would be served, but it would never bring Rachel back. The darkness that had consumed John Daniel's soul had taken everything: his wife, his faith, his future, and now it had left him with nothing.